Okay, so it's come to the stage we've all been dreading. Re-topology. G'day everyone, Dikko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. This is part 5 of my ultimate character building series. And in this video, we are going to be talking about re-topologizing the face. Now, what the hell does re-topology even mean? Some of you may have never heard of this term before and are just scratching your head going, what the hell is he talking about? Well, this video is for you. I'm going to give you my top 3 tips on how to approach re-topology with animation and rigging in mind. I hope you find it informative, fun to watch. And of course, if you do appreciate what I'm doing here and you want to support the channel, feel free to like this video, subscribe to the channel. And if you want to give a few dollars, feel free to jump over to Patreon and drop a few there. I'd be really appreciative of any help I get. Anyway, let's jump right in. Okay, let's start from the top. What the hell does re-topology even mean? Re-topology is essentially the process where you take a high poly sculpt, like an object or a person that you want to animate, and you optimize it for rigging and animation. Usually that requires you to rebuild the mesh from scratch using the sculpt as a base. Now, there are a bunch of tools that can do this automatically to some degree. However, they aren't exactly very smart about how they go about it. So sometimes, or most of the time, especially if you're going to do characters that can talk, you need to do it manually. Now, that's what the process of re-topology is all about. Taking a mesh and making it more useful for the animator to use. Now, there are a bunch of principles involved with how you go about that make it more efficient for certain uses, particularly around facial animation, body movement, and that sort of thing. And that's what I'm going to touch on with these 3 tips. Okay, so my first tip for this video has everything to do with edge loops or edge flow. All right, so what are edge loops? So edge loops are basically continuous loops of edges that help you maintain the structure of your character when it comes to deformation, rigging, and animation. Okay, so let's just jump in and have a look. All right, so you're probably looking at a character like this for the first time and you're thinking, what the hell am I looking at? Especially if you've never done any sort of re-topology before, or maybe you have tried and haven't succeeded. Don't fret, all right? It's okay. We're gonna go through this step by step, but we're not gonna do it with this character just yet. If we talk about it with this character in mind or any relatively realistic character in mind, it just becomes way more complicated and way more confusing when you have to sort of distill all this information into such complex shapes. So we're going to start with a much simpler character. So we're going to park this for now and jump into these 2 guys, these thumb characters. Okay, now these thumb characters will probably give you more information about re-topology and good practice than like 90% of most YouTube channels that cover this sort of crap. So let's talk about it. And this will lead us into my first tip, which is all about edge flow. Now, these 2 characters look identical from the outset, but let's go ahead and turn on the wireframe and see the differences here. Now, if you've never done this before, you're probably looking at the wireframe and thinking, I don't see any fucking difference. What am I looking at? Well, we're looking at 2 vastly different characters in the way they are constructed. Okay, in the way they are constructed, they look the same but constructed differently. One is constructed with animation and rigging in mind. The other one is just constructed in the most basic ways you can think of. Now, the one on the left is the basic one. The one on the right is the more, I guess you can say, advanced one. All right, it's just constructed properly, basically, put it that way. All right, so the one on the left, if I were to break it down, is basically just a tube with faces deleted and then formed into what looks like eyes and mouth. So they're basically just a bunch of quads that have been deleted, and then I've gone ahead and just shaped them into a mouth. All right. The one on the right, however, has been constructed with eyes and a mouth in mind. Okay. So what we have is specific edge flow. Keep that word in mind. Edge flow designed for deformation of the eyes and the mouth. So what is edge flow? Edge flow is essentially the way that the meshes are constructed via the edge connections. So the way the edges are connected from one poly to the next determines the edge flow. Now, the best way you can determine edge flow is by highlighting or selecting a loop. So if you go ahead and push Alt and click on any given loop in Blender, it will select any connected edges for that loop. Now, this can be done on any loop. So this can be done here, 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 and they're not technically loops. They're just the flow of these particular spans of edges. So you can see here that we have a looped edge here, a loop set of edges on the eyes here and here. But on the other one over here, these just don't exist. So if we go ahead and try select this face here, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. Okay. That's a problem because you can't really isolate regions of the face very distinctly or very easily, put it that way. So see how they're just spanning across the entirety of the face all the way around the back? These are still edge loops, but they're not flowing in the right way, so to speak. All right, which can be problematic for a number of reasons. Now, why does all this matter to begin with? Well, edge flow matters for two main reasons when it comes to a mesh's design, and that is for deformation, and the other one is for volume. So, volume preservation and just volume in general, like the shapes of the character. Now, when I talk about deformation, it means anything: blend shapes, deformers, and rigging, armature, all sort of good stuff. So, when it comes to deforming a character, a mesh like this can be a lot more difficult to get the right shapes working. So, if we go ahead and then turn on a smile, for instance, I'm going to make this character smile. You'll see a few key differences between these two characters. The first one being is just the way that the volumes are being maintained a lot better or a lot more efficiently in the properly constructed mesh. If you look at the one on the right, on the left, sorry, you'll see that things start to cave in on itself. So especially as it deforms, you see as the character smiles, we start to lose a little bit of structure in the corners of the mouth. That's one thing that we can notice here. If we look inside the mesh, you can start to see that the actual mesh is starting to crush a little bit as well. Whereas with the one on the right, if we look at that one and look at it more closely, you'll start to see that it appears as if it's crushing, but it's not really. Its its structure is actually being maintained a lot more strongly because of these supplementary loops that sort of help construct the mouth. You'll see that we get better volume preservation because of that as well, as we have an extra span of loops sort of maintaining the structure of the face. Now, that is really important because as you start to build out more complex emotions and more complex shapes, you want to make sure that you have the geometry to accommodate that. So you can see from the one on the left that if we look at the geometry now, again, with that in mind, we are very limited with how much flexibility we have when it comes to creating complex emotions. Now, namely, the geometry simply isn't there. If we go and try and add more geometry, it doesn't really add it in the regions that we want it the most. So if I go ahead and add a new loop here, it's going to add more geometry and add a little bit more structure, but it's adding way more structure in areas that we don't need it than in areas that we do need it. Furthermore, if we add a loop here, it's just going to travel around the back of the head. Instead, what if where logically you'd want to be able to sort of have it affect the bottom as well automatically. We can't do that here. You have to actually add two extra loops just to get a little bit more geometry to get that to work. And even then, it's not really working all that well because the geometry here is unaffected. The part where it matters the most, like it just doesn't get affected because the flow is traveling around to the back of the head instead of back up into the mouth, to the corners of the mouth where we need that structure. That is a real pain in the ass because all you're going to end up doing is adding more and more and more geometry to get that volume and that structure in place to make it work. And even then, it's not really solving the problem, it's just exacerbating it even further and making it more pronounced. So if we turn off the area there, you can see here, it's not really giving that nice fleshy feeling. It's just making those corner crushes stronger, making it more problematic. Okay, so let's contrast that with the properly constructed one. Now, if I want to add some more volume there, it's pretty easy. I just have to make a single loop. And notice how it simply just travels right around the mouth. And now if I want to add a little bit more nuance to the face, for instance, I want to, I don't know, bring in that mouth a little bit closer. I don't know, do something like this and soften that out so it doesn't crush as much. Now I can do that. It's really simple. I can now smooth that out. And now I have a much softer transition because I have the structure to allow me to be able to pull that off. I can even tighten up that corner even further. And we're getting this really clean smile. That looks super clean. And we've got tons of nice volume there to help amplify that emotion even further. Now, another thing you may have noticed about the well constructed one is the way that deformation is largely isolated to its specific area on the face. So, for instance, with the mouth, deformation is largely being isolated within that region. With the eyes themselves, same thing is happening. Only the eyelids are really being affected. Whereas, as you can see with the one on the left, we're getting a lot more follow through across the face. So, like areas around the edges of the eyes and around the edges of the mouth are largely being affected by stretch and crushing already in the default pose. So you can see here with the mouth, even though I haven't animated it, we're getting this stretching effect in the geometry. And if I bring it into or out of a blink, the same thing's happening here where we're getting this stretching of quads across areas of the face that aren't technically part of the eye. By isolating these regions, you are effectively allowing yourself to work in isolation when it comes to animation without the worry of it sort of stretching other parts of the face or other parts of the body. So, to see what these regions look like, you can just highlight edge or face loops in this case. This will tell you what regions you're basically able to play with. And notice how we have this nice clean region for the mouth and these nice clean regions for the eyes. Whereas if I try to do the same thing over here and try and choose a region to work with, I can't really do that. Selecting the face loops, I guess you can say, of the uh, basic version, you can't really get any isolation of geometry. You're basically having to manually go through and select these areas uh, as a whole and sort of memorize that you only want to affect these particular pieces of geometry. Real pain in the butt, if you ask me. And especially if you're going to be working with more complex shapes. All right, so we've talked a lot about deformation already when it comes to using proper edge flow to achieve it. Now, let's talk quickly about volume and how these edge flow and face flow help to maintain or construct areas of volume. Now, be warned, what you're about to see may look a little bit like nightmare fuel for some of you, but it's still a really great example of why these loops actually help out. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on a volume pass on both these characters. So the geometry hasn't changed. Like the actual geometry hasn't changed. But you can see here that this one on the left looks way worse than the one on the right, even if they both look creepy as fuck. Now, this one oddly has some humanistic characteristics to it, like voluminous lips and a brow line that actually terminates in the middle and has some pretty strong eyelids. Okay. And this is all because of the way that these edge loops around the eyes and the mouth help to build out these volumes in a much more effective way. Whereas with this one here, it kind of looks like really crappy 90s 3D stuff like you see in old renders. And that's basically because the geometry just can't accommodate these volumes. Um, and we've talked about it briefly before, but the only way to get these volumes to match what we see here is to add more loops. The problem is that by adding more loops, you're adding like areas of high density in area compared to other parts of the face. Whereas this one is maintaining a certain degree of consistency in the mesh density across the entirety of the face. And even if you want to add more density to or more volume to the one on the right, it's quite safe to do so without it affecting the rest of the face. So, for instance, if I want to add more density to the lips and get more definition out of it, I can easily add new loops um, in just the mouth region without it populating throughout the entirety of the face. That's one of the key things here when it comes to um, these isolation regions of a given character design. So that means I can go ahead and I can easily add more detail. So maybe I want to add a cupid's bow or something like that in the lips, or maybe I want to add um, more of a cleft in the bottom of the lip. I can now do that fairly easily without it being a problem. And voila, Bob's your uncle, easy peasy. And now we have even more definition in the face, more volume without it creating this nightmare of extra geometry in areas that we don't need it. Okay, so with all that information about edge flow out of the way, let's talk about my second tip, which is all about symmetry. Now, symmetry, not in the sense that you think I might be talking, in terms of just symmetry left and right. I'm talking about symmetry within the edge flow of your character. Now, what the hell is he talking about there? Well, let's jump in and find out. Okay, so the second tip of this video has everything to do with symmetry. Now, I'm not talking about symmetry in the sense of having a symmetrical character that is mirrored. No, you can have asymmetrical characters, no problem. What I want to talk about is symmetry within specific kinds of loops, notably loops that deform the eyes and the mouth. What I recommend is making sure that you have an even symmetry of edges around an eye or a mouth to aid in rigging. Okay, rigging and deformation, especially. Um, Having asymmetric elements within an eye or a mouth makes the process of rigging an animation a lot more frustrating at the very least. Now, let me demonstrate. So, what I've done, I have gone ahead and recreated this mouth that you see here on this character in a very simple mesh here. Now, in this case, the mesh is symmetrical. So, if we look at the spans here, we have exactly 24 spans. And if you were to split it in half, it would be 12. So 12 across the entire span, like so. But furthermore, we have symmetry in the vertical as well. Okay, so we have 6 edge loops on the bottom, or 6 edges on the bottom, and then 6 edges on the top as well. And what that means is that if we were to close this mouth, for instance, we would have the spans across the mouth line up evenly across the top and the bottom of the mouth. Okay. What that means is that if I were to go ahead and bind this mesh to this armature, it becomes a lot easier. One, you get a much more consistent result on an automatic weighting. So if I were to deform this now, it's going to deform way more consistently if we didn't have this going on. So you can see it's deforming quite well. But two, if you had to manually weight paint this, you can do pretty simple maths to achieve a very consistent result. So, for instance, as you can see here, we have a joint on every second span, manipulating this mesh. Okay. Now, if you wanted to have a very equilateral weighting, all you have to do is weight this span with 1, this one to zero point 0.5, and then with this joint here, this one's also zero point 0.5, and then this one is 1. Now, again, if you haven't done rigging before, I know this sounds like gibberish to you. Let me just demonstrate very quickly. So if I were to go into this mesh and do a weight paint, so every joint here manipulates every vertice to a value between 0 and 1, 1 being 100% influence and 0 being none. And you can weight them in between along the way. So for instance, if I want to weight this particular joint here with a weighting of 1, all I would need to do is grab my value here and just weight it to a value of 1. Now this span here, I want to weight to a 0.5 value between the second joint in this mouth rig. So if I wanted to do that, all I would need to do is bring my weight value down to 0.5 and weight that accordingly. The nice thing about this, however, is I can move now onto the next joint, do the same thing. Weight the middle of our influence here to 0.5, and then the span directly in front of that to point to a value of 1. Now, the nice thing about doing this is that if you want to be super consistent, the bottom behaves in the exact same fashion. So basically, all I need to do is repeat the process at the bottom, a weighting of 1 at the bottom, then 0.5, and then a value of 1 on the next joint. And that will give me a very linear weighting, but it's just a good demonstration of why this consistency matters. Because if you want to have easy rigging and easy blend shape making and all sort of stuff, this becomes super, super useful. So if we go out of weight paint mode and into pose mode, you will see that we'll get this really straight influence between the spans compared to this one where it's a little bit less even. Because I didn't weight paint that one yet. Same thing at the bottom. Now, this becomes more of an issue when you start to add extra spans in an asymmetrical fashion. So if I were to go ahead and do this now, add an extra span into this geometry here and here, I would essentially have to divide my weights across these joints with a lot more thought. So basically, I would have to go ahead and, go into, sorry, Blender's weight painting selection is a pain in the ass. We'll go ahead and select that joint, make sure it's a weighting of 1. But now that because we have 4 spans at the bottom and we want to get the exact same result as what we have at the top, we have to do more math and more consideration, which is a bit more, well, a lot more annoying, 4 times more annoying to be fair. Okay. So that means now we have 4 spans or 3 spans. So if you want to be technical about it, this would have to be 33% weighted to the other joint, 66% to this joint, or maybe even 75, 25. Let's do that, 75, 25. So now I have to do 75.75 on this joint, on this span here, then 0.5, and then 0.25, and then I have to repeat the process again on the other joint. So I'd have to go ahead and do the same thing. In this case, in the opposite fashion, 0.75 this way, then 0.5, and then 0.25. So I'm effectively tripling my workload, okay, by doing this. It's such a pain in the ass. And no one on YouTube talks about this. No one. To get the same result as the top and the bottom, I just had to triple my work because of that, because I wasn't being consistent in the symmetry on the top and bottom spans of the mouth. That's a real pain in the ass. And even furthermore, is that if you want to smooth these weights out, you will get more detail at the bottom than you will get on top. So you get an inconsistency in the deformation, an inconsistency in the character deformation. So if I were to smooth out these weights again, let's demonstrate this. Let's do a weight pane and then go to weights, smooth weight, and start to smooth this out for all groups. Let's just do that a little bit more. There we go. I think that'll do. Yep, that'll do fine. Notice that now we're getting a much nicer, sharper transition at the bottom between these two joints. Like, it's still smooth out, but we're getting a lot more detail at the bottom than we are at the top. Because we just don't have the geometry to accommodate that nice sort of wavy effect in the geometry at the top of the mouth. Now, if you want to be consistent in your animation and your character design and the deformation, you need to make sure that you have consistency on the top and the bottom of your mouth and eyes. Okay. That's why it's really important to have these symmetrical elements within a given area of the face. So, what I recommend, especially for the eyes and the mouth, keep it consistent. All right. Keep the spans consistent. If you're going to have 6 on the top, have 6 on the bottom. If you're going to have 4 along here, have 4 along here. Okay. That's really, really, really important. In my opinion, it makes rigging and animation so much easier, even making blend shapes so much easier. Okay, so we've talked about edge flow and we've talked about edge flow symmetry. Let's talk about my final tip, which is all about how to apply this information to your own characters, because every character is different. How do I apply, or how do I think about or approach all this information under my or your unique circumstances for your character design? That's really important, and I feel like I have the right information for you. So let's jump right in and talk about it. Okay, so my final piece of advice for this video is learning to take a design first approach to your retopology. So what do I mean by that? Basically, what I'm saying is that under certain circumstances, you may want to design your edge flow in a specific way, depending on your needs for whatever animation you're creating, whether it's for a game or for a film, what kind of render style you're going for, that sort of thing. So for instance, this character here has a pretty strong nose and a pretty strong brow line. And that's intentional with this character's design. And sometimes you may need to accentuate that through the edge flow and how you choose to create the connection points for different areas of the face. And other times you may need to just say, I don't actually need to embed that into the mesh. I can get away with it using textures and using normal maps and stuff like that to help bring those details back. So you have different ways to approach it. If you can't rely so much on texturing, you may need to bring those details into the retopology process. So as an example of that, here with the brow line of this character, I've actually embedded a loop that travels from the tip of the nose, up the bridge of the nose, around the brow line, and then down around the cheek. This is just helping me accentuate that brow line in a physical way, if that makes sense, in a very literal way. Whereas if I wanted to, I could technically just bake down these details to a texture map and then maybe apply it to something simpler like this one, which is essentially just the exact same principles of our little thumb character, but with those loops extended out further to come into connection with one another. So for instance, the mouth loops here are basically being extended further and further out from the mouth until they come into contact with the eye, where we have our own individual eye loops. And the rest of the face is just your basic quad structure to carry out the rest of the expression. But that's not to say that this isn't any less functional than this one. It's just a different approach that you would take to create your character. So if I were to show you what that looks like with a smile, you can still see that the smile is working quite well here. And I can show you with this physical one here as well. It's working out quite well. But that's not to say that this one's not working either. Let's open up this one. We're getting a different kind of smile. In fact, it's actually, I would say that this one's a little bit more appealing actually with the way the smile is deforming because we're not getting as many pitching points. That's interesting enough in its own right, but we can talk about that in the next video in more specific detail about why that's happening. But you can see that the simpler approach sometimes may be the better approach with all things considered. And that is especially the case with lower poly characters. So if you're going with something like, say, a toon shaded character or a character that is going to be intentionally designed with low poly in mind, then you may even have to go even simpler. So for instance, this is a pretty low poly character here. This is basically just I wouldn't call it a decimated version of the high poly one here, but in the circumstances of, say, a toon shade, these lower poly characters actually start to render out a little bit better than the higher poly. And you can see this because when you start to deform the character. So let's go ahead and give all these three characters a smile. And you can start to see what I mean. So with a higher poly character, you have a lot more volume to play with, but that also means it catches shadows in different ways, and you have to be very specific with every blend shape you make so that the shadows don't look ugly when you go to render it out. Otherwise, you would have to end up building in some more custom attributes to the mesh, like custom normal maps or custom normals themselves to get rid of those shadow lines that you don't want. So you can see here that on the cheek line here, because of this extra volume we have available to us when we're sculpting out the character's blend shape, we're starting to catch these pretty disgusting looking shadows, which is something that you don't generally want in a toon shaded character. You want to keep your lines pretty clean. So you can see here that on a lower poly character, like this one here, those shadows settle a lot nicer. And if you go even further lower poly, so say you want to use it for a V-tubing character, or maybe you want to go with a low poly game character with a toon shaded effect, then going even further low poly may help you even better. So you can see it's actually settling out those shadows a lot nicer than the high poly. These, in my opinion, look much more appealing, even if they do have a few other jagged lines here. That's more to do with the shader. And even if I were to subdivide this one with a modifier, let's go ahead and go subdivision surface. Those lines are still looking pretty good because it's averaging out the lower poly and then adding extra subdivision, and we're getting a much nicer result in this version of the face versus the higher poly retopology version. So what I'm essentially just saying is come to terms with what you really want from your character, and then make a choice as to how complex you want that retopology to be, because sometimes it just isn't as necessary as you think. So I would bet that 9 times out of 10, a character with a very simple retopology design like this is going to achieve what you want out of the character. And then if you want to go further down the line, like add wrinkles along certain lines of the face, like maybe you want to have a sharper wrinkle line along here for older characters, then maybe a retopology such as this, where you have the edge flow flowing over the mouth and then over the nasolabial crease, may be of benefit to you because you have that area to crease in. Or you may want to add even more complexity, like what I have here with the one that I showed at first, where you have to embed certain edge flows to make those parts of the body more accentuated. Okay, so those are my 3 tips on how to retopologize a character with animation and rigging in mind. Now, I personally don't think I've seen anyone talk about retopologizing characters with those considerations in mind from the get-go. So I hope you found this information really useful. Now, in the next video, of course, we're going to apply this stuff directly and retopologize a character from scratch, at least the face from scratch, so you can apply that to your own characters as well in Blender, of course. And yeah, stick around for that. Get subscribed so you can see when that pops off. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Catches, have fun, and I'll see you later.